Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Laura Allen, so I'm a graduate student working with Danielle McNamara at Arizona State University. Today I'm going to talk to you about some work we've been doing with our writing tutor, Writing Pal, to provide more affect-sensitive feedback and adaptation to students. And this is a collaboration with Caitlin Mills, Matthew Jacovina, Sidney DeMello, Scott Crossley back there, and Danielle McNamara back there. All right, so the focus of my talk today is on writing. Like I said, we study language and writing in our lab. A big focus of our research is on comprehension, the way that people comprehend text, and also the way that they integrate that information and produce text for a particular audience. This is sort of an understudied domain within our field of learning analytics, but it seems to be growing a little bit. And so one of the, I have a main focus in my talk, which is talking about affect in writing, but another big focus of my talk is just sort of maybe to encourage people to study writing, to think about how they could think about the way that students are writing and to start studying it bigger in our community. So anyway, so why should we study writing? Why is it important to think about writing? So one reason is that writing skills are very important for things that we do in academic context, things we do for our workplace, and also for our social life. So, we always think, when we write, we think about, writing reports or something, in class when your teacher asks you to write a report. I recently went home and found a report I wrote on seals when I was in 4th grade, and it was boring. But anyway, we also write all the time in our daily lives for work and for social life. So I answered emails today, I've written emails. But also here's our LAK website. And to be really meta about it, this is actually the hashtag for the Writing Analytics LAK workshop. So I thought that was anyway. So one problem, though, with writing and with writing research is the fact that writing's really difficult. I'm sure many of you have had times before in your life where you're trying to write something and really struggling to generate ideas, really struggling to think about who your audience is, what they want, what you want to communicate with them, right? And so it relies on a lot of different cognitive and social skills. So we have to have knowledge of vocabulary. We have to have good vocabulary, sophisticated language. We also need to know about what we're writing about. So people with higher knowledge of what they're talking about tend to be better writers. We have to use strategies. So we have to be able to leverage that knowledge in specific ways in order to produce high quality text for particular people. And we also need to be motivated. So if I'm not motivated and don't understand why I'm producing some sort of piece of text, then I'm probably not going to do as good on the text task. So then, not surprisingly, given all of these complicated processes surrounding writing, students tend to perform very poorly on tests. This is across many different countries. Standardized tests show that students consistently underperform on writing tests. So in the United States, for example, only 25% of students exit high school as proficient writers, so that's pretty low. And so what can we do? What can we do as educators, as learning analytics researchers, as educational technology developers? What can we do in order to improve students' writing skills in the classroom? So a lot of research recently has suggested that one of the best things you can do is just practice. But that practice, just writing over and over and over again, isn't going to do it. What you really need is deliberate practice. And what I mean by deliberate practice is the type of practice that you're doing when you're getting feedback, you're getting someone to actually respond to what you're doing, and then you're producing more text, but continuously getting feedback. And then recently, kind of recently, Steve Graham, who's a big writing researcher, did a study showing actually the best thing you can possibly do is to have deliberate practice in conjunction with explicit instruction. And so you can have explicit strategy instruction, teach students what they can do, and then get them to practice and give feedback that's explicitly tied with that instruction. And that's very effective. But another issue with that is that teachers do not have time to do that. So if we want students to be writing more in a classroom, which is a big goal, and what we need to be doing is just to get them to write, teachers can't be providing personalized feedback for students on every single essay that they produce. It's not reasonable. And because of that, just students aren't writing. So it's a big problem that students just don't produce because teachers can't provide enough feedback for them. And so in response to this, recently a lot of educators have developed computer-based writing instruction systems. And these are just sort of systems that students can engage with, where they can type an essay and then they receive feedback or scores on their essay. And this is not meant to take the place of teachers or to say that this feedback is the same as a teacher, but it's meant just to provide more opportunities for students to write and receive some level of feedback on what they're doing. So there's multiple different types of these, just to walk you through it and get you familiar. So underlying all of these systems are things called automated essay scoring engines. And what these are is these are just algorithms that use natural language processing to extract features, linguistic features from text. And then they use machine learning techniques to sort of model expert human scores on essays. And then these systems have been used and developed in many different huge corpora of essays to provide feedback to students, or not feedback, scores on essays. And these are used in like high stakes tests now. I mean, I don't know if you've heard, but a lot of these are used, you know, in the ACT and the SAT, you know, in the United States and in different places. So more recently, these essay scoring engines have been moved, not just being used for high stakes writing assessment, but also have been integrated into classrooms so that students can actually engage with them and be provided with instruction on their writing. I mean, we call these automated writing evaluation systems when they give feedback, when they give some sort of formative feedback that students can respond to within the system. And then finally, now people are moving towards not just giving feedback, but also having instruction. So we can link that with instruction in the form of intelligent tutoring systems. So these are the main three types of computer-based writing instruction systems that are sort of prevalent right now in the literature. And they all assign essay scores that are very comparative to expert and teacher raters. And they've been shown to be successful at doing, you know, providing accurate feedback. But there has been some criticism of these systems. So critics over time have argued that there are a lot of problems with the system, that developers are focusing way too much on providing accurate scores, and in doing that have missed the mark on sort of what it really means to provide feedback that's helpful for students. So one of these is just that they're not personal. So, you know, when someone submits an essay to a system, the algorithms are not taking into consideration anything about the student, anything about their writing session, about their mood, about what they've done in the past, about their skills, all these different sorts of things. They're just not being considered. So another thing is that they lack human sensitivity. So for example, you know, if you had a teacher who knows you really well and knows that you were in a bad mood one day and you wrote an essay, then they might give you different sorts of feedback, or they might intuitively know to give different sorts of feedback. I mean, these systems don't do anything like that. But they also can pick up on humor. I mean, you know, teachers can, but the systems are not as good at picking up on sort of human language, things like that. And then the other one is that they're only effective in very specific contexts. So when you move them across different types of essays, these algorithms don't tend to be very flexible. And so a lot of these critiques are very reasonable. They're very good critiques. And so in response to that, researchers in this field and developers of writing technologies have started to move away from focusing on accurate scores, because we already have pretty accurate scores. And then what we've been moving towards is focusing on providing feedback that's more nuanced and personalized to the user, and then also providing more adaptive instruction in response to these assessments. So why does this matter? Why do we care about this? So here's my little example. So this is Erica, and I know I drew it myself. No, I didn't. But Erica Snow is one of my colleagues, and so pretend that she wakes up in the morning and she's going to go to school and she's going to be in her writing class. And so, but Erica wakes up very late because didn't hear her alarm clock, and she was up way too late last night, and then her coffee maker wasn't working, and so she didn't have coffee, and she shows up late for work, and she has to sit down and write this essay, and it's something she doesn't care about, and it's on some prompt that she's not interested in. She sits down and she's just miserable. She's just very unhappy, and as a result of that, she produces an essay that maybe isn't her typical type of writing. Like maybe she's normally a really good writer, but today it's just, you know, she's going off task and she's not being very engaging. She doesn't care who her audience is. She just writes something. In contrast, consider this is Scott. So Scott's over there. And Scott's normally not as good of a writer as Erica, but I know. But on this day, he woke up and he made some waffles, which he likes, and had milk. And then he got to work early and he's in a good mood and all these sorts of things, right? And so he produces an essay. He's really engaged. He gets in a state of flow. He likes what he's writing about, and he produced a different sort of essay than he normally would. For this example, if you were using a typical automated writing evaluation system, both of these students would just receive the same score. They would just get like a 3, right? And so if both of these students got a 3, then they would probably also be given the same sort of feedback. the same sort of instructions on how to improve their essay, and the system would adapt exactly the same way for both of these systems, despite the fact that both of these situations are very different. Both of these student users are not engaging in the task in the same way and would probably benefit from extremely different types of instruction. So our approach and our goal with this type of research is to start moving our systems and other automated writing evaluation systems into a place where they're more sensitive to students' affect, more sensitive to students' individual differences. Specifically in this study, we're going to talk about affect, but we've been thinking about this more broadly as well. And so the way we do that is to embed assessments of students' writing processes that go beyond the holistic essay score. So embed assessments of their affective states, embed assessments of their vocabulary knowledge within the writing task. And then to leverage what we learn from these assessments to provide more nuanced feedback that's sensitive to individuals, sensitive to their processes. So specifically within the study, like I said, we're focusing on affect. And so affect has been shown recently to be a really critical component of the writing process. So when students get into a state of boredom, for example, it can completely derail them versus when someone gets in a state of flow and they can sort of write and get really good ideas out. And I'm sure you've all experienced the state of flow before. I know I do it. And the days where I can't get into flow, I'm a terrible writer. And then other days, it's better. And so what we want to do is try to look at these states of high engagement and high boredom and see if we can detect that based on features that we already have available in these computer-based writing systems. So as you might already know, affect detectors are commonly used in a lot of different computer systems already, but they haven't been used in a lot of systems for ill-defined domains. It's much harder to measure affect in these situations, and also because we have longer writing sessions, it's harder to sort of get at what students are feeling while they're writing. So specifically, my goals in the current study were first off to examine the efficacy of using features that we already have available in these systems. So we're specifically focusing on student level features, text features, so features of what they write, and also process level features. So what are they actually doing while they're writing? Are they pausing for long periods of time? Are they rapidly typing? And then also to see whether or not those can be used to detect whether or not students' writing session was a high affective, highly engaging session, or a low engagement session, or similarly for boredom, high boredom or low boredom. So all of this is conducted within the context of the Writing Pal, and Writing Pal is an intelligent tutoring system that we've developed in our lab to teach high school and early college students writing strategies. So these are some of the different videos and games. So in WPAL, there are multiple modules, and students can interact with the system in multiple different ways. So first, they're introduced to different strategies for different processes of writing, so the different stages, so planning type strategies, drafting strategies, revising strategies, and they're narrated by these little animated agent people. And then students can practice what they've learned in the videos in the context of educational mini-games. So these mini-games provide students a way to practice what they were taught in the video without having to resort to writing an entire essay all at once. So they can sort of be scaffolded up to it. And then finally, we have an automated writing evaluation component of WPAL. And what this is it's just a basic word processor window where students can have prompts. There's pre-made prompts in WPAL, but teachers can also input their own prompts. Students respond to these prompts. They can select a timer if they want to practice being under time constraints, or they can just write however they want. And then they submit their essay to the WPAL system, and they receive both summative and formative feedback on their essay. So the summative feedback is up at the top. It maps onto a typical 1 to 6 standardized sort of essay scale, and we do poor to great, so it's not numbers, but, and then we also give them formative feedback. And the formative feedback is explicitly related to the instruction that they were taught in the lesson videos. So over time, we found that WPAL, in a number of different studies, WPAL has been shown to increase students' performance, their self-assessments of their performance, their metacognitive awareness of their own performance. It also increases their engagement and persistence and willingness to keep practicing with writing over time. All right, so if we're thinking about Writing Pal, and one of our big things that we're concerned with right now is how do we provide this adaptive feedback? What do we do? So what do we have available to us? Rather than having to build all of these new features into the system, what do we have in WPAL that already exist that we might be able to leverage to provide assessments of how students are feeling or thinking without having to build new detectors or new things? All right, so one of the things is the individual differences. So when students first start interacting with a lot of these writing systems, they input a number of different individual differences. Like we get their demographic information, so information about your gender, your native language, things like that. We also get information about, a lot of times we get information about their perceptions about themselves as a writer, or their perceptions about writing in general. So do you feel comfortable about writing? Do you feel really negative? Some people feel very nervous to write, and some people feel very confident and really enjoy writing, and that can influence how they feel during the task. And then we also get things like their prior skills and knowledge. So we get things like vocabulary knowledge, stuff like that. So these are all commonly collected individual differences in these tutoring systems. So beyond individual differences, we also have text features of the essays that we can collect from these systems. So obviously if students are submitting an essay to a system, then we have access to the text that they submitted. So we can use that to provide information maybe about the student's affect or their individual skills, as opposed to only using it to model essay scores. We can look at word levels. So we look at the types of words that students are using. Are they using sort of engaging specific words? Are they using more vague words? Are they using really simple syntax, really complex syntax? Are they varying their syntax over time? Are they using, do they have paragraphs beyond just what about them, but do they have them? And if they do have them, are they semantically similar to each other? Are they very different? Are they sort of deviating? And at the essay level, we can also look at sort of the style of writing. Are they being more narrative? Are they being more informative? Those types of things. So how are they actually writing their essay? And then finally, the last thing that we can collect from our systems is the keystroke log. So keystroke logs aren't as commonly used in tutoring systems, but if we're thinking about how we might be able to detect something like affect, keystrokes might be a very important way to sort of get at the writing process. So like I said earlier, if you can think about a time that you've been in a state of flow versus when you're having writer's block, right? I'm guessing, right, that your keystroke patterns were very different in those different states, right? I know that when I'm in flow, I just write, I just go, versus when you're sort of distracted or you're, sort of all over the place and you have a very different sort of prosody about your writing. So basically, we're going to use keystroke logs to look at students' online processes to see if sort of these proxies for online affective states might tell us something important about how students are engaging with the WritingPal system. And we're going to we built a keystroke logger into WritingPal, but more recently there have been a lot of keystroke loggers that are all of a sudden coming on the market. And so a lot of people have started to do this to look at the writing process very recently. All right, so going back to the current study, so what are we actually going to do here? So what we did is we had undergraduate students come into the lab and they wrote essays on a number of different domains. So we didn't want to only model something like an SAT essay. We wanted to model different types of essays that students might write. And they were given 10 minutes to type the essays, and we ended up with a total of 132 essays across the study. We collected individual difference measures, which I'll talk about later. And then after students finished writing, we also got them to do a retrospective affect judgment. And so what this meant was that we got, so the whole time that students were writing, we were recording their face, and we were also recording what they were doing on the screen. And so then after they were done, what we did is we showed them both of those things at the same time. So we showed them the video of their face and then also what they were doing. And every 15 seconds, they were prompted to say how they were feeling. Were they engaged? Were they bored? Were they neutral? We had a few other affective states, but they were like nobody ever selected those. So we're not going to talk about those here. But like sadness and things, and no one just got sad in the middle of writing. But so anyway, so we calculated affect proportion scores for each essay session. So what proportion of the time were you engaged, or what proportion of the time were you bored, or what proportion of the time were you neutral? And then we split students up into each writing session was either high or low engagement, high or low boredom, or neutral. So like I said, we collected individual difference measures. Those related to students' scholastic aptitude. So these were like their self-reported SAT scores. And we had writing apprehension, so how they feel about the writing task. And then also their exposure to print, which is sort of a proxy for their literacy ability. How much do you know about, literacy? How literate are you? And then we conducted text analyses. So this is the product measures that we're talking about. These are the measures that we typically use when we're trying to model essay scores. But we went a slightly different route. So we didn't use the features that are necessarily always related to essay scores. Instead, we used features that might be more related to students' affects. So we used Scott Crossley back there has developed a really nice natural language processing tool called Seance, which you can ignore the accent because that's just an auto thing. But anyway, what it looks at is sentiment within text. So we use that, and then we also use cometrics, which many of you are probably familiar with. And we use the easeability component scores, which are component scores that tell you about features of writing a text at multiple levels. So it tells you about the sophistication of the words, sophistication and complexity of the syntax, different sorts of cohesion, as well as the style of the essay, like I was talking about earlier. So is it more narrative, or is it more sort of expository academic text? And then finally, we calculated a number of keystroke indices related to students' writing process. So first we looked at things like verbosity, like how much were you writing in general. We also looked at backspaces, so those have been shown to be indicative of sort of revision behaviors. So whether or not people are engaged might mean that they're more likely to sort of actually be actively revising their essays. We looked at latencies, so the amount of time, what is your longest time where that went between doing anything versus the average amount of time that you spent. And then we also looked at different types of pauses. So we looked at how many long pauses did you have versus how many shorter pauses. Okay, so then in order to analyze our data, we had statistical analyses, or we conducted statistical analyses to classify students as each session as high or low engagement and high or low boredom. And so what we did was we took all of our indices, we removed all the non-normal indices, and controlled for multicollinearity. So especially with linguistic data, there tends to be a lot of multicollinearity, so we kept in the ones that were most strongly related to the groups and then removed others that were multicollinear with each other. And then we conducted MANOVA analyses between the high and low engagement groups and the high and low boredom groups to select the indices that were statistically different between the two groups. So I'm going to go through two analyses. The first is the analysis on boredom. So this is looking at differences between essay sessions that were high boredom and low boredom. And then I'll do the same for the engagement analyses. All right, so what we did was we calculated the MANOVA for the boredom, and then we inputted those indices into a discriminant function analysis. We actually ran multiple classifiers, but that was the most robust to cross-validation. So we report that one here. So we had 6 variables that were significant in the model, and we were able to classify students as high or low boredom with about 77% accuracy using multiple measures. So with the boredom analysis, there were multiple types of measures that related to students' boredom, but mostly they were focused on the actual writing task as opposed to the students' individual differences, which I'll get to and I think is important later. But writing apprehension did load. It's the weakest of them, and then the rest of the indices relate to either the actual text, so the sort of linguistic or semantic features of the text, or relate to different sorts of pause times in the text. So now moving on to the engagement results. So we had similar accuracy for the engagement results, but we only had much fewer variables were actually loaded onto the final model. And those variables related mostly to students' individual differences. So exposure to print and writing apprehension were both related to students' engagement, and then just median latency times also related to students' engagement. And so this is very different than the boredom analysis, because what we see here is that students who were highly engaged or low engaged were more differentiated based on their individual differences as opposed to aspects of the writing process, or at least in our model. All right, so just to discuss. So these computer systems, like I said, they're really focused on accuracy. And what we wanted to do in the study is just take an initial step towards trying to figure out whether we could use features that are already in the systems to sort of model students' affective states while they're writing. And so what we found was that we used indices at the student, the text, and the process level, and they were all able to work into a model to classify students' affective states during writing. And so we think this is important because it tells us, it allows us to start thinking that we might be able to build these affect detectors and actually build more instructive feedback for students. And so the analyses, though, revealed similarities and differences between high engagement and high boredom. So here, an essay session could have technically been classified as both high engagement and high boredom if a student was, was high engaged at the beginning and then highly bored at the end. Technically, some essays could have been both, and they were. And so we weren't differentiating between that in this study, but what this points to, and we found that there were certain indices that were predictive of both high engagement and high boredom, which is really interesting, and obviously isn't something that we should put in a final model because it would be confusing. And so what this points to is that future research should be conducted that's more sensitive to the linguistic features and the context in which these different things were happening, right? So when pauses happen, does it matter when you pause? And does that have something to do with whether or not you're engaged or bored and things like that? So in the future, one thing we want to do is start to develop profiles of student writers. So rather than just saying these are good writers and these are bad writers, are there different types of good writers and bad writers? Are there the sort of apprehensive, nervous, bored bad writers versus the ones that are more engaged, but they just don't have the skills that they need yet? And these types of students might need very different types of prompts, different sorts of instruction over time. Another thing we want to do is, and we've already started doing, is doing more real-time affect detection. So I told you that they made affect ratings every 15 seconds. So one thing we're moving to is, in addition to classifying the entire session, actually classifying within different segments how engaged or bored are people. And we've had really good success with this so far. So another one is interactions between affect and other student variables. So looking at whether or not there's different sorts of types of people that are more or less likely to experience affect in different sorts of ways. And then finally, the whole point of this, obviously, is to develop better feedback and more adaptive instruction. So our real future big picture goal would be to take this and develop better feedback that is more sensitive to students, that provides more personalized detection that will maybe allow systems to be more sensitive and helpful for the students. So I just want to thank my co-authors, all those people up there, and then my lab, and then I'll take questions.
Okay, questions?
Really hate the microphone. So I'm wondering if you've thought about any intervention strategies within the platform that looks at if a student is not in a flow state, to help them either get back into a flow state or assess them prior to writing whether or not they're ready for a flow state.
Yes, definitely. So both of those things, I'll speak to both of them. So, but I'll backwards. So the first thing is that one thing we're trying to do is figure out if there are certain sort of, we usually will get motivational measures also sometimes before people write, before their sessions, and seeing whether or not we can kind of predict whether or not they're more likely to fall into a state of flow based on how they felt beforehand, and whether or not that's interacts with their sort of perceptions about writing in general. So if you feel nervous about writing and then you're also in a bad mood, probably less likely to get into flow versus someone who's maybe a good writer but just not in the best mood or something. So that's one thing, and we've been sort of working on that. And then, the other thing was interventions, yeah. So one thing that we are moving towards, but we haven't done yet, is trying to figure out when is the best time to perturb people, because we don't want to give them so much online feedback that they get derailed, if they're already bored and then we're, derailing them even further off. But we want to keep them sort of on task and trying to figure out when that is most appropriate and sort of how to prod them in that way. So initially our idea is just to still give feedback at the end of the session the way we always do, but just give feedback that talks more about, what they were doing and tries to sort of get at their affective states and talk about how they might be able to change the way they're thinking about the thing. So talking more about audience, talking more about the purpose of writing, rather than just saying, here are some strategies for writing a good essay. And then also looking at changing the next prompt, so changing difficulty or changing the content of the prompt. So it was like an academic style writing, and then switching them to a more social, or controversial type topic to see if that'll change the way that they are writing. But then, yeah, in the future, we also are trying to figure out if there is an appropriate way to sort of prod people in the middle of writing, or whether or not that's just not going to be helpful at all. But we haven't done it yet.
I'm wondering if, in the beginning, if you assess them in terms of their state, and if they're frustrated or something, that you could actually get to them to write about their frustration before they go into whatever writing exercise that you're giving them, or even perhaps giving them options in terms of what to write about, so that it matches better what they want to write about as a kind of motivational strategy.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. I think it would be worth testing, yeah. Because I would say that there's a part of me that thinks it would be very helpful for them to talk through their ideas, but then there's also literature suggesting that sometimes if you're already in a mood, or if you already have an opinion about something that's negative, or something that by writing about it or by talking about it, you just get more, confident in your belief systems. And so, but I think that's an empirical question, right, is whether or not asking them to do that will sort of, help their state and help them to be more ready for the writing task at hand. I think that's a great idea. So, thanks.
Any other question? Okay, if we could thank our speaker.